Balfour, and a lot of people are talking about that anniversary, the fact that if Netanyahu would have abided by the terms of the coalition agreement, then today or this week, Benny Gantz would have become prime minister. As we know, that didn't happen. We went to another elections, and Netanyahu believed that he would be able to form a government relatively easily. He wasn't able to. And so basically, we are where we are. We saw that against certain naysayers, at least from the beginning, Netanyahu certainly promised people in his camp that the budget wouldn't pass, that the government would fall within a certain amount of months. But we saw that didn't happen. This razor-thin sort of mishmash of parties from the left, center, right, and an Islamist party for the first time in Israel's history joining a government. We saw how it actually worked relatively well. The leaders, especially at the leadership level, worked really well, really to try and keep fires to a minimum, to keep disagreements to a minimum, really to focus on the goal to pass the budget, to try and get something in the budget for every single party. There's a lot of compromises. No one got everything, and that certainly doesn't happen in any coalition politics, but certainly one as diverse as this. But now the budget is passed, there is a certain amount of stability. There's a 2-year budget, so it gives a certain amount of time. And now that we have that out of the way, it's almost certain that at one point, Yair Lapid will become prime minister. If the government falls at any point, Yair Lapid will become prime minister for the interim. In other words, the few months of campaign and even afterwards until our new government is put together. So it appears almost certain that at one point Yair Lapid will be entering the prime minister's office on Balfour. But the question is now, what happens now that the budget, which was really the most practical hurdle that they needed to pass, has now been passed? Are we going to see a split along ideological issues, perhaps religion and state issues, perhaps on the Palestinian issue, on Arab-Israeli issues? What do we see happening? So first of all, before I answer that question, I think we need to look at what usually happens in regular governments. We know that Israel hasn't got the most stable system. I've described it in the past, how it gives almost complete representation, but limited stability. No Israeli government has ever seen out its term. The closest was, I think, about 4 years. It's a government supposed to last 4.5 years. So usually what happens is for the first 2 years of a government, there is a relative stability. Everyone understands you need 2 years to at least have some level of achievements. And then usually there's a sort of 2-year itch where people understand within the next year or so, because the average is only 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, within the next year or so, there will be elections. So every party starts thinking, okay, there will be elections at one point. What differentiates me from other people, other parties? Let's say, if you're a right-wing party or a religious party or a left-wing party, there's other parties to the slight left of you, to the slight right of you on various issues. So how do you differentiate yourself, and whether you're going to become the party that brings down the government, whether one of your issues is going to bring down the government? Because again, you know that you're going to go to elections and you're going to fight it out with those who sat very comfortably alongside you in the government for 2 years. How are you going to try and pull their voters away, knowing that you sat quite comfortably, for 2 years and worked well with them? How are you going to differentiate yourself in the mind of the voters? That's very important with such a crowded spectrum, ideological and political spectrum in Israel. It's very important for every party to show to the voter why they necessarily need to receive your vote. So usually, as I said, there's a certain amount of stability for 2 years, because during those 2 years, you can get a few achievements on the board. You can show what you're about. You can get some of the promises that you made in the last elections on paper, passing the law, or whether through government or whatever it is. And then you can say, look, I did this, and now I'm going to do even more. With this government, it's really an unprecedented historic government, because it is probably, arguably, the most diverse in history, especially on the issues which divided Israeli society for so long. When you ask someone if they're right or left in Israel, it's almost certainly on security issues, on Palestinian issues, where you stand on a Palestinian state, where you stand on borders, where you stand on the peace process, where you stand on the Palestinians, Abu Mazen, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have very wide gaps. If you really look at the spectrum, regardless of what some of the opposition is saying, Yamina are pretty right-wing, to the right of Likud on many issues. They are solidly against a Palestinian state. And on the other side, you have Ram or Meretz, which are solidly in favor of a Palestinian state, somewhere close to the pre-67 lines, with a division of Jerusalem, some sort of Palestinian presence on the Temple Mount, probably even some level of refugees, although there's a bit of difference there. So on that issue, let's take that issue to start with. On the Palestinian issue, although there's been really a large amount of Israeli public figures who have gone to visit Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas in recent weeks and recent months, it's not expected that there's going to be too much movement on the peace process. Certainly ever since President Biden came into office, there's been an expectation to at least move things forward at certain levels. And as I said, in the previous government, there were almost no direct contacts with the senior levels of the Palestinian leadership, perhaps on some bureaucratic or security issues, but certainly not political meetings like we've seen Defense Minister Benny Gantz has met. We've seen leaders from Meretz. We've seen Ram's leader, Mansour Abbas. And they made Mansour Abbas, it was very interesting because considering where he stands on the Palestinian question, he went to great pains to explain that the Palestinian-Israeli peace process really didn't come up in the meeting. It was more of a meeting to get to know you. And the fact that Mansour Abbas admitted or went to great pains, probably at the pressing of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, to say that, no, we didn't discuss the peace process. It was a get to know you meeting. We discussed Israeli society, the Israeli-Arab issue, but not really the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And that shows really that someone like Mansour Abbas is really being quite responsible and faithful to this coalition, because it's important to note that while we do have a budget and while there are, in theory, lots of achievements in there, especially for Ram, especially for the Arab Party, nothing has happened yet. Budgets have been proposed, numbers have been adopted, but nothing has been given at this point. It's going to take a while. For example, for the development and progress of Arab towns and cities around Israel, there's been tens of billions, if I'm not much mistaken, of shekels that are earmarked now for to develop some of these places, also to fight intra-Arab violence, especially in the Negev and the Galil. That's come up again this week with violence we saw again outside a very prominent hospital where two Arab gangs were fighting each other and throwing stones at each other and shooting at each other. We saw another murder, again, intra-Arab murder in Arab society. And so there's a lot that Ram have to do before it can go back to the voters. And that basically is true of any of them, any of the parties. If you look at what's still gluing this coalition together, is one person, to a certain extent at least, is Benjamin Netanyahu. As long as he's there, as long as he's in the opposition, as long as he's the leader of the Likud, that probably will remain a major gel for this government to stay together, because they know that with Netanyahu there, the Likud will be a very strong, will have a very strong showing in the next elections. The problems that Netanyahu has, or the other members of the Likud have, and we've talked about that in recent weeks, is while the Likud will do much better with Netanyahu, Netanyahu still fails, according to every single poll, to be able to reach that magical 61. Now, he is getting closer because at the moment he only has 53, or the right-wing religious bloc only has 53. And according to polls, he's at 58, 59, but to get to 61, he doesn't have at the moment. So while he remains in that position, it remains a very strong glue for this government. There are other issues that are coming up, whether to provide electricity to illegal, unregistered Arab towns. That's already becoming a bone of conflict. There are certain understandings in the coalition, but a committee member, Knesset community member from Ram Party, went beyond those understandings this week, which caused a bit of friction. Now we hear Sharon Cheskel of Gideon Saar's New Hope Party, who says that she will not vote with the government because they refuse to pass a legalization of cannabis, at least medical cannabis at this point. She claims, and her party at this stage seems to be backing her, that it's part of the coalition guidelines that such a law should be passed. But there's disagreements, first of all, from the health ministry professionals, but there's also a problem with RAM on religious Islamic principles and opposition to cannabis. So that could cause a headache, because while the leaders, I would argue, have a very good relationship, and they've shown that they can work very strongly together, regardless of ideological differences. Because don't forget, these are government ministers who are working together. They're bridging that divide every single day. You know, the transportation minister, who's from the left-wing Labour Party, will perhaps have to deal with someone from housing from the right-wing New Hope Party. And, you know, they have to work with each other despite their ideological differences. So at the leadership level, there's goodwill, there's good relationships. But in a government of 61, all it takes is one member to say, I'm no longer voting with the coalition. My issue is important. They want to make a name for themselves, perhaps at this point. They want to show that on their issues, they're very strong. Perhaps they want to show for their own party primaries. Perhaps they want to make a play to move to another party, to maybe even create a new party. So that's probably the greatest worry at this point. It's not really at the leadership level. It's that the leadership has to keep every single member of their party in line. Now, we see certain parts like Yesh Atid, which is probably the most centrist party, which doesn't seem to have a problem. Yair Lapid has kept his MKs in line, not to say that they're all agreed on everything, but they're pretty solid on those issues, which, you know, they need to be. But it's more at the margins. It's more the likes of Ram, Meretz on the left, who want to make a name for themselves, maybe something on the settlement issue, because that certainly has come up and will come up, where to build, how much to build, what to do with the illegally built settlements or hilltops. And on the right as well, they're dealing with the same things. They want to make sure that there's more building, so they can say, you know, it's called a unity government, but we will not give up on our right-wing principles. So there's going to be some disagreements. There's going to be some individuals who understand that every single MK is critical, and you know, one person can overload their positioning here and basically say, until I get what I want, I'm not going to vote with the coalition. So that is the possible strain on the coalition. And we'll certainly see over the weeks and months ahead who are the individuals who are likely to break coalition discipline and try and make a name for themselves. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on those issues that I've already raised, or anything else that's on your mind.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry, for a very interesting analysis. We'll take some questions. I'm asking again, please send your questions, because we didn't have so many. So the first question, please, by Sandro Balestrino. Regardless of when the next elections are held, do you think that the Prime Minister Bennett has committed political suicide by bringing Ram of the Muslim Brotherhood into the government?
Well, I don't think we can say regardless of when elections will be held, because I think that's key. Bennett needs to have a good couple of years to show that he hasn't been affected by the more left-wing elements, and he's able to rule an unwieldy government, to show prime ministerial credentials, to show that he can lead. Don't forget, he is the prime minister of the smallest faction in the history of the state of Israel by far. So he needs to have stability. It's very much in his interest, especially he's not polling great. Netanyahu and the Likud are landing their punches, especially when it comes to Ram. In the lead up to the budget, there was all sorts of suggestions that Israeli taxpayers' money budget, the Israeli budget was going to Ram for all sorts of nefarious things, including money for Hamas. There was a very long show investigation into it. In the end, they demonstrated that nothing from the public purse goes to Hamas, and the organization itself gives to people in Gaza, but not to Hamas. But it certainly was something that caught the attention of people, I would argue, even who are center-right. So certainly that played into Liquid's hands. And despite Bennett's denials, and despite Bennett trying to convince people that, this is a right-wing government, I think he used the expression at one point, this will be 10 degrees to the right of the previous government. At the moment, it's not really getting through to the people. The polls have shown that Likud are strengthening at the expense of not just Naftali Bennett's Yamina, but also Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party. So at the moment, Likud, sort of what they're saying, that this isn't a right-wing government, that this is a left-wing government, and they keep on mentioning this is a Ram-led government, a Lapid-led government, and Bennett is hostage to that. It is a message which is getting through, according to polls, on the right. So if there's elections very soon, without too many achievements for Naftali Bennett and not enough time for people to get used to him being prime minister, then certainly he will not grow as a faction. But if, again, we see elections in a couple of years where he's really shown his credentials, has been able to get some right-wing wins, then perhaps we can see a little bit more of a resurrection there in the polls, and then perhaps that can be translated at the ballot box. So I think it's all a matter of time. So the first part of your question is, regardless of time, to my mind, time is everything. Timing is everything. The longer, the further elections are pushed, probably the better Naftali Bennett will do. But if there are elections pretty soon, then yes, I would say he's probably in trouble.
Mr. Perry, thank you. Let's go further to the next question. Very relevant question by Bernard Lieberman. What is the status of the charges against Netanyahu?
Well, we saw quite high-profile news about this week. There's 3 cases at the moment against Netanyahu, which we've described in the past. The most serious one, which is case 4000, which is that Netanyahu specifically helped Bezek, which is the national telephone carrier and internet carrier, with legislation, with bureaucracy, promoted their interests in exchange for positive coverage through one of the major Israeli publications, Walla, which was owned by the same owner as Bezek. That's the accusation. And basically the prosecution at the moment is bringing its witnesses. There's been quite a lot of information. Probably the most important witness is taking the stand. It was actually put off a week, called Nir Hefetz, who was an advisor to Netanyahu. And while the case has been made, or at least the prosecution would argue the case has been made, that there was a lot of interference at Walla in favor of Netanyahu, really getting down to the minutiae of headlines, of the way pictures, images of not just former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but also his wife and even his son, and the attacks on some of their political rivals. What needs to be done is also to show that there was a quid pro quo there. It's not just enough for a politician to try and get themselves good coverage, because obviously every politician does that, but whether there was a quid pro quo. And Nir Hefetz, being so close to Netanyahu during the years in question and having turned a state witness is extremely crucial. So much so that it came out this week that some new accusations came out that some of the billionaires related to some of the other cases were actually buying Sarah Netanyahu jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars at the couple's request. Again, these are the accusations. I'm not saying whether they're true. That's for the court to decide. But basically, because of these new accusations, the defense has asked for a postponement of a week, which the justices have provided. So it'll be very interesting to see what Nir Hefetz has to say, because obviously the state case against Netanyahu rests very strongly, not completely, but very strongly on Nir Hefetz's shoulders. And if he can give the sort of testimony that he has provided during some of the questioning and interrogation, then the prosecution would assume that it'll be in a good place. So we'll certainly know where the case is standing in the next few weeks. At the moment, it's going really at a snail's pace. Every single witness, and there are hundreds of witnesses, are being questioned by the defense, by the prosecution. But as I've said repeatedly since this whole episode started, this is going to go on for years, because even when the cases are found one way or another, there'll be appeals from one side or another, and there'll be a whole appeal system. So this isn't going to go away. If Netanyahu or the state wants to take it to the end, we could be talking about 3 or 4 years down the line.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry. I would like to take a question, very interesting, and I think that the fact that you live in one of the biggest settlements, actually, you can provide a best answer. Chris Rankin asks, could you see an agreement to supply electricity to both unofficial Arab Bedouin communities and Jewish settlements?
Well, I mean, the Israeli settlements, I should say, because not everyone who lives in the settlement is Jewish. The Israeli settlements, the recognized ones, get electricity, just like the Palestinian towns get from the Palestinian electricity. The Israeli settlements, or the Israeli communities over the Green Line, are on the Israeli electric grid. What you probably are talking about is some of the unrecognized and in the Israeli state's eyes, at least illegal, sort of created on their own without the backing of the state, as opposed to the major blocks. I'm assuming that's probably what they're talking about. But again, there would probably be quite a bit of a disagreement on the left, because what they would say is one element is taking place within sovereign state of Israel. In other words, some of the Bedouins in the south. That's certainly the case that Meretz would take, and Ram and Labour, and some of the left-wing elements, that there's a world of difference between what's happening in the sovereign state of Israel and what's happening outside of it in over the Green Line, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it. So I'm not sure if there's going to be necessarily a quid pro quo there, because I think the left would reject it, because they would say the two things are not equal, and you can't put what's going on within the sovereign state of Israel, what's going on outside of it. So it could be that something, sometimes there are compromises that go, behind the scenes, but I doubt that the left-wing parties would stomach having something like that as a sort of public offering.
Thank you. Next question by Eric Selkov. The Jerusalem Post is reporting that Palestinians are concerned that a civil war is looming. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, what we saw this week, relatively unprecedented, was a big funeral, I believe it was in Jenin, and outside of the refugee camp. This is an important element, which saw openly Hamas flags, some of the participants dressed in Hamas military fatigues, with Hamas banners, chanting Hamas slogans. And that's something which we have not seen at that level in the West Bank, in the Palestinian-controlled areas, for quite a while. And it certainly is something that's worrying Fatah, especially Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of Fatah and the leader of the Palestinian Authority. There is going to be a crackdown. It's probably something that the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, I mean, it is something that they share in common, this unease, to put it mildly, about having Hamas take hold, or have some sort of hold in the West Bank. What we have seen over the last few years is certainly a loosening of the grip of Fatah in some of the major cities. And today, it's argued that Mahmoud Abbas, some would say, he doesn't have a grip of what's going on the ground. And we are reverting to a certain extent to a pre-Oslo reality, where each municipality pretty much controlled itself, developed its own security, economy, social services, and it was decentralized. Obviously, Oslo Accords created the Palestinian Authority, and it was supposed to be centralized under a leadership with a democratic system. Because of the mistrust, perhaps, of Mahmoud Abbas, because of the way the Palestinian system is run, many would point to corruption. there's been a sort of weakening of this centralization, especially also when there's been strikes or demonstrations about social services, about education, about all these sort of things. We've seen the Palestinian security services come down very hard. It was a number of months ago, a very prominent Palestinian critic was picked up in Hebron and was beaten to death by Palestinian security services. That was the straw that broke a lot of the camel's back for a lot of people. A lot of people very angry. So a lot of people who understood that this is the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, and obviously they found it abhorrent, and they took to the streets, and there was repercussions for those who took to the streets. So I don't think we're at the point of civil war, but certainly Fatah do not have as much control, or the PA does not have as much control as it used to. Mahmoud Abbas is certainly not seen as a strong leader. His approval ratings are extremely low at the moment. Some argue that he's been buttressed and propped up by the West, and that's the only reason he's staying in charge. As we know, he is, something like 16, 17 years into a 4 or 5 year term. He refuses to hold any sorts of election, whether it's presidential, parliamentary or municipal, perhaps because he believes that Hamas would win in the West Bank, which again would be unprecedented. So he certainly has very little legitimacy in the West Bank. The question is whether Hamas can get a foothold. Again, the scenes that we saw this week would demonstrate that it's certainly trying, and we know it is trying. But I don't think we're at the point of civil war yet, even though there are regular clashes between clans. We heard about this in Hebron. So I would say it's closer to anarchy at this point rather than civil war.
Yes, and just to add and remind that Mahmoud Abbas is 86 years old.
Of course, also a factor.
Yes. Okay, thank you very, very much. We have come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Thank you, Mr. Perry, again, for taking the time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 Eastern for a webinar with Aram Hamparian on the Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020, an Armenian perspective. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great day.